Hi, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. My name's Glenn Ford, and I'm here talking to Mike Hutchinson.
I made a billion suns, among other things.
I helped make a billion suns. We're a couple of games designers, games developers. We've put out a few games that are out there, and we are attempting to give the wealth of our experience to the world by talking about how to make better miniatures games.
Yes, let's do that. What are we going to talk about, Glenn? I'm excited.
Today we're going to have a chat about a subject that we've repeatedly and possibly annoyingly for some viewers alluded to and never dug into, and that's the process of writing a campaign system, or in a more general term, a system to link together a series of smaller, shorter games into something a bit bigger and more epic. And we're going to talk about some of the ways of doing that. There's possibly two major versions of the way that you might go about that. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons to each of that general job. And hopefully we'll talk about some of the fixes for some of those problems. And we might discuss some of the ways that we and other people have tried to fix them and try to sort of cut through their particular Gordian knot, because we've tried most of those systems and we've had prolonged conversations about all the other ones.
Before we get to your definitions, I want to know, Glenn, what was the first campaign of anything that you played? Miniatures Wargame campaign.
Oh, crikey. There's going to be a long pause there.
I'm pretty
hard in your head.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I played. It would have been either Necromunda or Gorka Morka first. So I entered the world of understanding campaigns from that sort of Necromunda direction. What about you?
I think probably the first thing I ever did in this ballpark was a wildly overambitious game of Mighty Empires, where every map battle was fought as a full Warhammer Fantasy battle.
We often talked about it in hushed tones, but we never attempted it, Glenn. Who would ever attempt it?
Three of us started that one summer holiday in our early teens.
When the summers were all forever.
Possibly the campaign table for that Mighty Empires game is still set up in a upper room in a barn of a friend of mine. And that was, and even when we had the ships for it, we did Man of War for some of the sea battles once or twice. I always had a great ambition to play it, and then whenever there was a boarding action of Man of War, do a skirmish game of the boarding action.
Of course.
And ideally just go smaller and smaller and smaller.
Exactly.
So that would be my
playing a drafting card dueling game to find out where the drops of blood land.
That's the dream. Never just do a sort of Achilles and the tortoise thing, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and never actually completing any action, but enjoying not getting anything done.
So I think we might have broadly outlined the two sort of areas of the topography of campaign system styles there. But do you want to give us a bit more of a rigorous definition here of where the campaign styles lie? I'm
unlikely to give a rigorous definition, but I'll give.
I'm disappointed.
A vague, squishy ballpark version of what the two groups are. Because because I do think there is a lot of crossover between them at various points. So the first, and I think this is the one that would, if you're being technical about your wording, be referred to as a campaign. Which is more of possibly a narrative system, where basically there are a series of games that will be played through, and after each game there's possibly a story element that gets unlocked, or possibly a part of the armies gets unlocked, but ultimately the way you perform in one game doesn't have a massive amount of impact on the on-table capabilities you have for the next game. So an example of that might be the End Times series of campaigns from Warhammer, where however badly you do in game one, the result of game one might be you have one hero missing in game two, or one of the sides gets to bring on half of their forces from an unusual table edge in game
But the
two.
important thing is that you are flipping through a book of history, recreating it, or you're flipping through a novel of exciting adventures, and you're recreating and capturing the spirit of each of those episodes in this arc of exciting times.
Yes, there's a set story. You will play Battle 1 at the fields of Elysium, and then you will play Battle 2, which is at the edge of the fields of Elysium, where you're getting ambushed as you leave the previous battle, and so on and so forth as you go along. And there's a story that you're playing through. So another great example of this is GW, when they did Lord of the Rings, did a campaign where you can play through the story of Lord of the Rings, and you can take a different fellowship, and you're going to end up in Barad-dûr. It's going to happen. Who you have there when you get to that point and what they're carrying might alter a little bit, but at some point you're going to end up in Barad-dûr, and you can have an encounter there, and it's going to be a set sort of encounter, and so on. And you're going to have.
I think, so just to go one level down. So as we're talking about kind of narrative campaigns, I think like there we're sort of discussing there's a linear one where you write a series of scenarios and they tell a story, and then of course you can do some other things. You can get a bit more dense. You can have a branching one where you've written some kind of choose your own adventure, where if the castle falls, then the goblins will have to be held back at the pass, and if it holds, then you can fight them at the river, and it's easier. And then I guess when you blow that out, just as with your Mighty Empires example, like you can have a map campaign as well, which is actually something I've played very rarely, because they're the most difficult to organize. But that is basically saying, all right, let's imagine we have a beautiful map of our fantasy realms, and we're going to just live in this map for a while, and we're going to battle over territories, and we're going to play Settlers of Catan, but with our forces. So linear, branching, and map campaigns are all classic.
I got very into writing map at one point at a local GW store. I did about 8 of them in a row, each of which was linked to the previous one, and the story in the next one was defined by whoever won the previous one. So nice. That got to be a whole thing. And then what you might call an escalating campaign, or a campaign where the various groups and participants build up experience, build up a story of their own as they go through the games.
So controversially, I actually don't think of these as campaign systems in my own terminology. So I like to think of campaign systems which are a way of telling stories, and progression systems which are a way of changing your force from one game to another and having one game. And I know that's slightly not how everyone else uses it. Like both of those things quite often get referred to as a campaign system, but I think you can have a campaign system without a progression system, and it's just lovely. And you can have a progression system in the absence of any narrative, and that's also lovely because it can make its own narrative up. So yes, I think from a games design perspective, I think it's good to separate those two things and hold them apart, because then you can make decisions about them independently.
I don't disagree, but I do think that if we're having a conversation about campaign systems, most people are going to expect
talk
about a progression system, and so that's one of the things we're going to talk about.
It is.
Sorry?
It is. I was agreeing with you.
Yes, splendid. Unusual, but splendid. So I think possibly in this part of
I feel like Glenn thinks I'm drunk, but shockingly I'm not in this episode.
It's always convincing when somebody tells you they're definitely not drunk.
It's pure water.
So I think possibly in this video we will talk a bit about those more narrative versions of campaigns, the series of stories that go from one to the next, whether you're going to do it in a linear fashion, we'll talk about those, a branching fashion, which I think is one of the other major subsections, or using some sort of map-based system. And a map-based system can end up being part of something like a league or some other system of ranking various players. And then I think that will run through into a progression system quite neatly. So as I say, the first and simplest version of those is a direct linear narrative campaign. That's something that you can see, as I say, in End Times, you know, Lord of the Rings from Games Workshop did it. It's something that I think Mike did a masterful job of with Gaslands Legacy, which is ultimately a linear narrative campaign system.
So the trick with these, as with the experience that I have of writing them, which is not extensive, the trick with these seems to be it's absolutely impossible to get started on these unless you have a good idea, or at least the first idea of what the story that you're trying to tell is. And obviously, if you're going back and doing historical gaming and you're trying to recreate a series of engagements, then that is all laid out for you, and the fun is to find out if they turn out the same way the next time round. But I think you've got to look at this from the point of view of like a series of like major scenes in a movie. Like, what is going to be the exciting finale, and how do we work back to sort of the humble beginnings and the foreshadowings of stuff.
And I think that the bugbear of a problem for any campaign system, I would say up front, is how you get all the players that start the campaign system to choose to finish the campaign system. And that is not necessarily an easy task. And one of the upsides to a linear narrative campaign system is that you're telling an overarching story. And part of the point of it is that everyone's along for the ride and everyone wants to get to the end of the story. And you're not necessarily, because you get absolutely pounded in game one, it's not necessarily going to mean that you're therefore going to get absolutely pounded in game two. And so that's a good way of saving people from dropping, because one of the main things that will kick people out of a campaign early is when they decide that there's no point them going on with it. There's no way that they can possibly win game four. So they
that was me last time I played Blood Bowl, and I took a Skaven team and got all of their tails kicked off, and then hobbled into the second match and was like, you know what, I'm just gonna play something else. This is rubbish.
But in a funny way, that does have a sort of disadvantage, because one of the things about a progression system where one person becomes completely dominant after game 5 is that if you're not really trying to tell a story and you say to them, well, you won, and it's a competitive system, they can go, yeah, I won, victory to me, just because I managed to do it in 5 games as opposed to 10 because I was that dominant. That just shows how good I am. It didn't come down to the wire. Whereas in a linear narrative campaign, if people drop out, there's no going, yay, I won, because there was no winning to be had. There's just, no,
it's just if you get to the end, you're like, oh, well, I was the most tenacious to like hang on with ragged nails to this.
Yeah. End times again. The problem is, the point is there that if you do write a linear narrative campaign and people don't get to the end of it, there's very little reward for them. They didn't. It's essentially getting halfway through a novel and then just stopping reading. It can be a real sort of.
So I think from a design point of view, like I think that if you're going to, like, maybe this isn't a perfect example, but I feel like you flipped through, at least in the initial End Times book, and we're like, oh, there's something different happening in every scenario. Each of these scenarios is unique. I can see pretty clearly they're not going to be even-handed, like the force selection is weird. But basically what that campaign system gave you, which I'm not sure this is something to aspire to, but it's certainly a way of approaching this narrative campaign problem, is like just provide a series of sweeties where it's just like, these are games you're like nothing else you're ever going to play. They're going to have something weird in them. None of these feel like an existing thing. And so that's the reason you want to do it. And they've done quite an interesting job with Adeptus Titanicus recently, where each of the hardback books that comes along has a series of like narrative scenarios that plays out the sort of story of that part of the history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And again, each of them is like, okay, so something weird's happening, like some asteroids are arriving or some people are landing in a drop zone. And like each of those games, you sort of flip to the book and you go like, oh, I'd quite like to play that because that seems new. And oh, there's another one beyond that. Oh, I'd quite like to play that because that seems quite different. So I think laying out a series, a linear narrative campaign, which at least has enough gameplay variation in the scenario design, I think is a good way of saying, come on through. There's enough on the roller coaster here that it's worth getting to the end.
I think it can sometimes run up against the other problem, and this is something I think we're going to end up referring to at various points in this conversation, is the nature of sort of locking up the sweet shop, where if you write a cool scenario for each of the bits of your narrative campaign and someone goes, well, you know what, the cool scenario 4 is the cool scenario. Look at all the cool stuff that happens in scenario 4. You tell me I've got to play through scenario 1 and then scenario 2 and then scenario 3. And then maybe if I've dug in that far, I'll get to play the cool thing that is scenario 4. And obviously that is a thing that can kind of suck about sort of campaign systems, is the thing of, I want to do the cool thing now. I don't want to have to tunnel down to the cool thing. So if you are writing, a linear campaign, make sure that each of those sweeties is as tasty as the previous one and as delectable as the following one. I think
it's interesting because that's sort of like in an RPG, in a more hack and slash RPG setup, like quite often you'll have level design, if you like, where you've got low level characters, and so the monsters need to be kind of piddly, and then as you progress through the situation, you're going to have leveled up, and therefore you can have more exciting, tasty, explodey monsters at the end. And so I think there is an interesting problem. Well, there's a natural way of writing a linear campaign, which is, okay, well, we'll start small and prosaic because that's how stories start, and then we will end enormous and epic and explodey. And I guess, although that is narratively correct for a 90-minute movie, is it correct for a 10-game narrative scenario that someone's going to need to invest like 40 to 50 hours in? So I don't think campaigns behave according to the laws of traditional narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with this sort of single path linear campaign, what you have to remember is, and I would say this is the main disadvantage of this system of campaign, is that your players are on rails very much. They're not telling their story, they're telling your story, or the story of
your haunted house.
Yeah, and what they can do, because what you can do perfectly well with the end time scenarios is you can read the end time scenario books and just go, all right, yeah, okay, let's say Jim won that one and then Frank won that one, and and that means that on this game, this is what we get at the end of it. And you'll have, not a dissimilar experience to actually digging through the whole thing.
So I found this problem to be very pronounced with writing Gaslands Legacy, which is the expansion, the campaign, the narrative campaign system that is available in Blaster 3 and soon to be completed in Blaster 4. But I got that sense sort of partway through writing. I got that really strong sense where it's like, this is a series of story elements which are going to occur, and although there are some ways that you can discover different sort of hidden elements, a bit like collecting the collectibles and documents that litter any video game, which kind of fill out the background. Like, that's the way that I approached it, was like, there's an on rails story that you're going to live through, and there's lots of other variety because of the way that the progression system works, but the actual story itself is very linear. And I guess I made the decision that I was happy enough with the other elements that people were going to have to dig into from the legacy point of view, that the story just needed to be like a really solid, compelling, exciting narrative, and it didn't need to be an interactive narrative. It didn't need to be emergent, player agency driven narrative for that campaign to work as far as I was happy wanting to write it.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing, each of these systems will have pros and cons. And I think one of the big pros of a single line narrative campaign is that, knock on wood, anybody who signs up to the deal at the start is likely to be there at the end, because they're not going to get just tanked partway through. They're not going to feel like there's no point carrying on. So, game 5 is going to be the way that game 5 is when they signed up to it. So I think,
yeah, I was going to say that, so one of the aspects that I think is really important for keeping players in the game, which can be delivered by a progression system, but can amply be delivered by nothing to do with the progression system, campaign system, which is what End Times does really nicely as well, is give hobby projects for each maybe each or every other sort of step of the adventure. So if we play a game and we had an okay time, and then we're sort of wrapping up and we're finishing our cold cups of tea, and we're looking forward to the next thing, we go, oh no, someone's going to have to. Has anyone got a dragon for the next one? We're going to need a dragon. Oh, has anybody got like some library shelves made up as terrain, because we're going to need that for the next scenario? And that like becomes an exciting reason to get prepped for the next game. And I'm sure you're the same as me, Glenn. Like having an excuse to get prepped for the next game is critical for the sort of hobby motivation, and that snowballs into enjoying getting something done in time for the next game night. So I think from that point of view, I think although you don't necessarily need to lock up the sweet shops, I think you need to have somewhere dotted through that linear campaign, like, oh, now you're going to need this thing that you're going to have to hobby up, or this unit that you're going to have to paint, or this monster that's going to rampage around that someone needs to source.
I mean, I think one of the things, and I don't know whether this is a conscious thing they did, but it's just something that I felt playing through End Times, is that Warhammer Fantasy Battle is, I've heard it said before, and I think it's not far off of being true. It's a list building game. 90% of the game is about an armchair process of careful list building, and the on-tabletop process is actually a quite small part of it in a weird way. And End Times,
assuming you have the basic competency to drive a Warhammer army, which Mike does not, and we'll maybe talk about some other time.
But End Times, it had like, okay, who's going to bring the Dragon Ogres to the next game? But it's fundamentally not a super hobby project based thing. Because
it was sort of like, oh no, who's got a Bretonnians army? Like,
yeah, nobody.
No one does
that. In my group of friends, nobody has a Bretonnians army. Literally got 2 people who own every Warhammer army that there is, apart from Bretonnians. Nobody owns Bretonnians. But the point I'm making is that in End Times, it ended up being more of a list writing thing than a hobby thing. Each time it gave you a bunch of very specific conditions on the list that you were going to have to craft for the next game. And that's a system knowing itself. That's where somebody somewhere, whether consciously you went, what people really want from Warhammer Fantasy Battle is for a campaign that says, okay, in the next one you've got to use these units, not those units. They've got to be wearing these hats and these shoes.
A really knotty, difficult, totally unusually shaped list building challenge.
So you remember that unit that you never take in that particular army? You've got to take 5 of them, and you've got to make that work. How about that? And that. So I think a certain amount of possibly know thyself. It might be the element there, and give people things to inspire them to the next game. Don't make it a chore. Don't sort of put weight.
One of my favorite examples. I'm not sure if you've played this, but one of my favorite examples of this is the. There's a Warhammer campaign about like you go to Albion and there's the little soothsayer miniature, and you're in the sort of the swampy fens and there's mist everywhere. I've just blanked on
it was the first of the worldwide campaigns.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't there when it was originally released, but I picked it up secondhand on eBay many years after, and like that's got this really nice, like, you land, there's a thing where there's the sea and there's some boats and there's a beach, and then you have to go to like the next stage where there's like a load of giants throwing rocks at each other or whatever. It's like, it's just got this really kind of, it's slightly plodding, but it's like, it's just a really nice sort of like that for me is a very nice template of like how to do a little narrative linear thing where each thing feeds a fun little kind of toy. And I suppose that's part of what I'm thinking with Gaslands legacy was like, how do I take each one of these things and turn it into a little set piece that's worth the time.
Yeah, and everyone could have a Truthsayer or a Dark Master, but you can only take one if the other person.
Yeah, Dark Emissary.
Yeah, but you can only take one if the other person had one. And yeah, look, I mean, I could talk a lot about the days of the Warhammer Worldwide campaigns, and the dwarves won a sword because they won that worldwide campaign, and from then on you were allowed to use that sword in like tournaments and things. It had become an officially added on item, and I always thought that was one of the best things possibly that I ever saw GW do. There was a campaign that the fans played through, and because of how each race did, they unlocked things that were then officially recognized things that you could use in the game. And I always wish they'd done more of that. So where it ended up with Eye of Chaos and Storm of Chaos and such like is the whole.
So I guess it's also worth shouting out. Like I think Joe McCulloch is sort of one of the like most active dudes in this sphere at the moment, where he's just released the Red King, which is a 10 scenario campaign which tells a story and that you have to play through, and it's similar to the Lich Lord one. I've forgotten the exact title of it, but Thor? Again, the Thor of the Lich Lord, and so that's that one I suppose is of those kinds where you start low level and it expects that you're going to be a bit stronger by the time you get to meet the Lich Lord or the Red King or whatever. And yeah, if you've not given it a read, Glenn, I really recommend giving the Red King a read, because it's got a bunch of batshit stuff where he attempts to like introduce reality warping effects. So as the campaign goes on, stuff starts getting weirder, and then the final campaign, which I'm sure is not a huge spoiler, because as soon as you get the book you're going to flip through and find this, but the final scene tries to do something similar to the wrapping tables that we were talking about on A Billion Suns. So it's on a geometric shape like a loop, and the loop keeps popping in and out, so things can not see each other or see each other depending on what orientation the loop is on. It's really fun.
There needs to be a game played on a Mobius strip at some point. Exactly,
where you can draw line of sight from one thing to another, but then not if you go underneath.
So as I say, one of the cons of that kind of single path narrative campaign is that it can feel like, and it can feel like, because it's on rails. You don't have a wild amount of freedom. You're living out somebody else's story. So the first and possibly most obvious way of breaking away from that is a branching campaign, and this is something that I think most gamers will be familiar with. It turns up regularly in various systems, and it's a fairly simple thing where you play game one, and then if one side won game one, you then play game 1B, and if the other side wins it, you play game 1A. So like you're saying, if the goblins manage to take over the castle, the next game is the soldiers trying to reclaim the castle. If they were beaten back, the next game is the soldiers running the goblins down in the forest as they flee away from the castle.
So amusingly, as I listen to you talk, I'm realizing that I think the first branching campaign I ever played was the one that I wrote for Gaslands with the war rig chasing. I've read plenty of them, but I'm actually thinking back, trying to think, this is quite an unfamiliar campaign format to me. Why is that? I'm not sure I've ever played on that. There's a classic Warhammer book, the Lustria campaign, which I think has a whole description of how to write these.
Lustria is an excellent book, and you should probably pick it up if you're thinking of writing any sort of campaign of this nature. So the upside to a branching campaign is obviously the players feel like they're having more of an influence over where the story goes. You can still have people feeling like it's worth playing all the way through the campaign, because it might be that after a certain amount of games, you can only get like a minor victory as opposed to a major victory, let's say. But you can always have it so that it's worth playing through to the final game. Even if it means that on the final game, you can at best get a draw, it's still worth, passing through to it. And you might well have it that it's a purely branching narrative campaign, and so the final game just has a story. It doesn't have a sort of set victory condition to it. One of the big problems with a branching campaign is that if you're going to do game one that splits into two paths, and then each of those paths splits into two paths, if you've ever, come across that thing of placing one grain of rice on the first base of a chessboard and two on the next, on four on the next, branching campaigns, if you can go to like 4 steps of the branching, then you're a brave man.
I mean, I think the way that I always approach this in my notebook is I'm always looking for hourglasses. So I feel like there are linchpin moments of your story, which if you're trying to tell a story, you're likely going to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And then you provide a couple of layers of branch optionality to get from A to B. And that's where the agency comes in. But I suppose like that's me from my inclination is to write sort of stronger storyline where it's not just like to provide a slightly out of context example. I run a fair amount of RPGs as the games master. Like I'm rarely the player, I'm often the GM. And I tend to run very railroady investigation type things where there's a number of ways to find the clues out, but you're always trying to hit those story beats and find out the thing that's happening. And I've never been able to run a sandbox RPG, which our friend Rufus is fantastic at. He'll just be like, you're in a tavern, off you go. And we're like, Rufus, what is out there? And he's like, I have literally no idea either. Let's go find out together. And I suppose that terrifies me and is horrific. And I don't know what to do with that sort of freedom. So I think like writing an endlessly branching campaign where you don't have a GM to make that stuff up as you go along, like that's almost where like, why aren't you doing a map campaign at that point, which at least constrains the problem or at least contextualizes the problem in terms of this force and that force are arriving in the same place. So I suppose that's something to think about. Is it a series of hourglasses, or is it a truly,
I think
chain of everlasting explodingness?
The smart way of writing a branching campaign is what I call a multi-thread campaign. And so there's like however many you fill up to 2 or 3 threads. And when each game is won, you just switch back and forth between the lanes of that particular multi-lane motorway.
Good, evil, neutral, doing well, doing poorly, doing horribly. Those sort of 3 thematic swim lanes.
So in actuality, the Gaslands Free Road campaign isn't really a branching campaign. It's pretty much a 2-thread campaign, and you just swap back and forth between threads depending on who's winning and who's losing.
That's right.
And there's a separate sort of ongoing count across those that plays out in the finale of the campaign. So if you're going to do a branching campaign, I would say it's maybe a rookie mistake to let it branch sort of freely. It's very tempting because you want to go, if you're going to do this, then there's that. It's much smarter to basically write a set of threads of scenarios and simply have the players change lanes back and forth depending on who wins and loses. You can write a full branching campaign. I would say a series of 4 games is the maximum for any sane person, because beyond that, you're not writing multiple different scenarios. You just going to end up looping back and forth anyway. You may as well save yourself.
That's a good point. So you've plenty of experience of writing sort of longer campaigns. I've done one recently. When it comes, would your advice be you are aiming to write a fresh wet ink scenario for every moment in this tree or in this narrative? Or is this the careful arrangement of cut flowers and you're selecting from scenarios that you'll know and love, but you're recontextualizing it? Like, those are different ways of approaching it. Have you
I think it very much depends on which of these systems you choose to follow. If you're doing a single lane narrative campaign, then I think every scenario has to be crafted, and it has to make absolute sense. And I have to know, oh, of course that's what's happening because Frank did that last game, and so it makes absolute sense that he would therefore be wearing that hat and in that building. If you're doing a branching campaign, then you're probably going to want to, at some point, go a weeny bit more generic so that it allows you to loop back around to various parts of the branch. And then if you're going to do what we might talk about in a minute is a map campaign, then you want those campaigns to be sort of ideally selected out of a table or preset with. It's nice if you can do some sort of linked and nesting tables for them to give some sort of narrative bite in there. So I mean,
so there's one aspect there that I want to catch on, because it maybe calls back to a previous episode, but when you so Gaslands Legacy does use all existing Gaslands scenarios. It doesn't have a special suite scenario that describes every moment. And actually what happened was I sort of knew what the story was going to do, and then I cherry picked scenarios that I thought could describe that. And it turns out that, I mean, I partly wrote to the scenarios, but it also turns out that like I have scenarios for chasing dinosaurs around, of course, like we can just do that. But I actually wonder whether, so writing scenarios in Gaslands is hard, and often scenarios the first time that they are written are terrible. And that might be my incompetence as a game designer, but I think it's much, much more likely that it's to do with the fact that writing multiplayer scenarios is really hard to get them to work consistently. And so I think that like there seems to be more tolerance for asymmetry in a two-player game when you're in a narrative situation where you can write quite a wonky scenario and shove it at the player, or at least the universe has decided that you can just shove wonky asymmetrical scenarios into narrative campaigns, and that's sort of somehow acceptable. And I suppose that's an interesting question of like, is that true? How much do these scenarios have to be play tested, and how watertight do they have to be? Because I know that the scenarios in Gaslands Legacy are going to be fun, although there's a bunch of rain falling on them from the progression system. I know at least their chassis is sound. Whereas as we're walking into those different scenarios in the end times, like, we've never seen these before, we don't know how to play, they seem to be wildly unfair for one player, like it seems to be telling us that they're wildly unfair. Like, why is that allowed?
I mean, just as an aside, the reason I think that scenarios are so difficult to write for Gaslands is that you can't stop in Gaslands. So
you never write a hold objective scenario.
Anything that involves holding an objective in Gaslands is impossible, and that is just because you just want to go hold that place, and then holding that place is just an absolute pain in Gaslands. But anyway, I mean, I think that hopefully once you've gotten to the point of writing a few of these games, you'll have a little sort of internal Rolodex of scenarios anyway. There are a set number of basic scenario tropes or cliches, whatever you want to call them, for most skirmish miniature war games, and exactly what I'm just talking about there as to why it was so difficult with Gaslands, because Gaslands has certain rules that doesn't let you fall back on some of those tropes, because everyone knows there's the hold table quarters, hold the line, break through to the other person's deployment zone, stop them breaking through to your deployment zone, kill off their most valuable thing, kill off a bunch of their least valuable things. Those are standard scenario tropes, not one of which works in Gaslands. So one of the reasons we had to very much go back to sort of first principles for a lot of those scenarios.
Well, I had to go back to video games a lot and find out, like, how a video game arena levels structured and why is that fun.
But if you're writing any kind of sane skirmish game, you're going to be able to fall back on the sorts of
work harder, do something more insane.
you're gonna for the first campaign you ever write, just to say, and probably should have said this at the top, the first campaign you ever write, please write it for a game that you already know and love. And that you have a pre-existing pool of people who know and love. Don't write it for your own system, and figure it out. I learned to write writing campaigns for Warhammer Fantasy Battle down my local GW store. And as I said, one of the best challenges you can set yourself is write a campaign that, without you forcing people against their will, a whole group of acquaintances will go all the way through without dropping out. Because if you can do that, you've genuinely achieved something in the world of scenario writing. If you haven't chosen a system that requires you to create bespoke scenarios for every part of the system, then you're going to need to sort of pre-build those scenarios in order to have some sort of solid basis to load them into a campaign. But if you haven't sort of got such a bespoke system, you can probably go back to the sorts of scenarios you've seen before and mold them a little bit to the campaign you're putting together. So you've got a sort of straight linear narrative campaign, you've got a branching campaign, and I think the last major part of the, let's say, the non-escalating side of campaign design is map campaign.
Now I'm really excited about this because I've only played a couple of map campaign like board games. I've never played a full map campaign. I have play tested a map campaign for Billion Suns a bunch, which I'm not sure is any good yet. And I'm really excited to hear all of what you've experimented with map campaigns. So I've got my pen at the ready to take some notes.
So the thing with map campaigns, and the reason that a map campaign, I think, starts to bleed into what will be the second half of this conversation, but there's a sort of more escalating campaigns, is that you're inherently giving players more freedom to, frankly, screw each other over. If you have a map campaign, the standard map campaign is you've literally got a map with a series of nodes on it that connect together through pathways, and each player picks one of those nodes and puts down some sort of base on it, and the base generates armies or squads or whatever of X size, and then they go out across those nodes and they either encounter other people's armies and fight them, or they take over other people's nodes. And you spread out across the nodes of the map campaign until one person dominates or takes over the whole map, and then they win the campaign, or you call it.
So is the simplest map campaign equipment one of those funny marble games with the star doodad in it?
I mean, I always tended to sort of write out on a large piece of card the map and then laminate it and then give everyone dry white pens, nice. And little colored stickers, so each player has a different color sticker, and it's a very cheap way of doing it.
Because in my mind, all map campaigns are played on hexagons because of Mighty Empires.
Because of Mighty Empires. So that very traditional map campaign inherently has the difficulty and the problem that one player sets up quite close to another player while another person sets off further away, and the two players near each other mash each other up, and the one person off in a corner spreads out. And
it's just exactly the same problem you get in a odd number of players deploying in a normal war game. It's just played out in a slightly different scale
over weeks instead of
over weeks
hours,
of unfairness.
And that is a major problem with that form of map campaign. There are other forms of map campaign. So, for example, you can have a asymmetrical map campaign. So, and this is something that, by and large, was done to a certain degree with Storm of Chaos. We're talking about those worldwide GW campaigns. For people who aren't aware, It used to be every year or so, GW would do a narrative campaign that every player in the world could play that week's scenario at their local store and then enter a result into a website, and it would all be correlated, and it would go onto a massive map for the campaign. And one of the early ones was Chaos, which was a proper map campaign, and the Chaos players got coordinated online and crushed the campaign, and that's a whole other story. But the Storm of Chaos one for Warhammer Fantasy Battle was Archaon is coming across the map, and he's inevitably going to get a certain distance across the map, and the Empire players have like little nodes and stations, and they just try and hold him back. So you can have a map campaign where one person is playing an encroaching force, and that instead of a traditional node, you've got a series of paths that player can go down, and they can commit certain part of their force to one path, or put all of it into another path, and the other players can be different races on different paths. So, for example, I wrote a campaign where a War is coming into an area controlled by dwarves, Empire, and elves, and the War player has a choice as to where to put his forces on those different paths in order to encounter the elves, dwarves, and humans. I did that because I had multiple orc players and not very many good players. So the multiple orc players were all on force, they were coming in, and it was a question as to how far across the map they could get before the War ran out of energy. And that's still a map campaign. You can play a map campaign where people don't have established bases. So again, I did a map campaign which was set on the sea, and so everyone had a fleet that would move around the map. And so there's no holding particular positions, nobody can run away. And if you end up finding yourself next to a particularly powerful player, you can just move your base off to a different part of the map. There are multiple ways of having players established. A map in a map campaign is a way of giving a shape to the scenarios that you play within the campaign. And there are multiple ways that you can use a map to give a shape to those games. Multiple ways that you can use it to tie together a narrative. And it's nice because it gives more freedom and more of a sense of control than your traditional branching or narrative campaign, but it doesn't necessarily have the snowballing of an escalation campaign. And one of the problems with a nodal map campaign is that it does lead to snowballing. It does lead to escalation, even if you have no advantage from winning extra nodes, other than the fact that you've got more nodes than other people. It still means that you're X many points ahead of everybody else, and other people call it. And it's the inherent issue with, and I think we'll sort of, in wrapping up this conversation, make a mention to League, and to a degree, tournament campaign systems. I don't personally particularly consider League or tournament campaign systems actual campaign systems. They're ways to score of games that hopefully you're playing anyway. They're just a rather unpleasant way of doing it because they eventually make people not want to play the games that they were going to play anyway, because now there's a little marker that says that they've already lost.
I suppose it's the difference between, are you in this to explore a story and come out with a story that you've told, or are you in this to figure out like who's the best player or who's got the best forces? It's like a championship of Formula One racing, like stories are going to be told, but like it's structured so that you get championship points in order to determine who's the best tech and the best team and the best drivers. And so like you say, like it's a competitive thing insofar as you want to find out who the best player is.
But to my mind, a campaign is worth existing if after one week of gaming, you're looking forward to the next week of gaming.
Yeah.
And you want to play the next week of gaming more than you would do normally. The thing with like straight up leagues or anything league-like in a campaign is, I've been in groups where people turn up week in and week out, year in and year out, to play the same game against the same people over and over. And then you put a league system on top of those games that are happening, and suddenly those people don't want to play the game that they've been playing for the last 6 months because they know that they've already lost the structure that game has been dropped into. League, I believe that league systems make people want to play the game that they're already playing anyway, less than they would do naturally. Campaign system should make you want to play it more than you would do naturally. Other people in the club should look at your campaign and go, oh, I wish I had been getting into that at the start of it. I wish I had thought to bring along my blah blah army, because look at how cool that campaign is. What it shouldn't have is have people who've gone, you know what, I've played this game every single week for the last 6 months. I think I'm going to bring a different system next week because I can't. Why do I want to play somebody who's beaten me 3 times and is 20 points ahead of me in the league?
So just before we wrap up this conversation, there is one other element I wanted to catch on, which is quite often when I've read blogs of other people like doing map campaigns, the temptation is to, I guess, look at this through the lens of like a real-time strategy game like Warcraft or something where, you know, maybe there are areas of the map that have different terrain types which change battles, or you can have a gold mine and that means you're slightly wealthier, or you can get magic items. Like that seems to me an interesting layer where you sort of take a map campaign and then you lay just enough rules over the top that it itself becomes a war game, which of course Mighty Empires is an interesting example of. Like, that's now a war game with war games inside it. Like, is that, did you explore that with your map campaigns, or do you try and remove any like additional, I'm making a board game out of these map campaign?
I played the sort of the war game, skirmish game crossover campaigns, and I've written a few of them. And the issue with it is, in my opinion, is that you get people who are good at tabletop skirmish games, and you get people who are good at traditional war games. If you get somebody who's good at both of them, then you just get an absolute juggernaut of a player who just goes, you can't beat me on both tables. I will beat you on one or the other of them. And then and the whole thing just becomes very quickly one person who's mastered both systems, just like, yeah, you can beat me on that table, but I'll beat you on that one. And if you can't beat me on either of them, you know, you're double crushed. I mean, it's hard to write a good, you know, map war game anyway. And it's hard to write a good skirmish war game. And if you give yourself the challenge of writing both of them, and both of them where they are interdependent within the other one, you know, where, okay, this, it's like, sometimes with computer games, you know, I've played a few computer games where you're playing one sort of game, like a tactical game, and then to achieve a certain thing within the tactical game, it suddenly cuts over to like a first person thing where you've got to like shoot stuff out of the sky. And very often in those sorts of games, the tactical bit becomes moot because you get so good at the first person bit. It's like, oh, my army of one guy can take on, you know, an army 50 times its size because I rock at this first person bit, you know. And that can happen where it's like, you know, because I'm so dominant at one part of this system, it makes the other part of the system just irritating for everybody else to play. So yeah, I've written them, I've designed them. I try to avoid them like the plague when I'm writing a campaign system. For me, the map system in a campaign should ideally be a narrative element. Like I say,
so it tells you what the stakes are for a particular game, or it tells you what the engagement conditions for the two forces are, and in particular, it tells you which of the two forces that get to fight this week.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's its best. It's a way of sort of organizing the players and telling them why they're fighting the person they're fighting, and giving them a way to sort of interact with each other. So I say with the sea-based you know, it had a system where everybody has their fleets dotted around, and when you turn up to club that week, you can engage with people who are in the same sector as your fleet, but not people who are in the other sector, and then you fight your game, then you can move your fleet over. And various sectors have different sets of campaigns. So this one has like a bunch of islands, so the games fought there will be from this particular table of scenarios. That one has a bunch of sea monsters, so that'll be from this set of scenarios. So you can choose to encounter each other in the sector. That gives a sort of narrative shape to the sort of encounter you're going to have. You can choose to decide who it is you're going to encounter, and you can know why it is that you're encountering that person, because your two fleets met in that sector and now they're fighting on the one island that has fresh water, and there are things coming out of the jungle at them.
Right.
And I personally,
that's very jolly. Let's go write a map campaign system for Gaslands. Why not?
why very much not. People
All
fighting over fuel in the desert. Righto. That's been a splendid conversation. We'll wrap that up there and move on to the thorny question of more escalating and progressive campaigns in the next conversation. If you have watched this far, I'm going to assume that you like something about what we've done. If so, please click the like button and maybe also click the subscribe button. If you haven't enjoyed parts of what we've said, please drop a comment in the comment section. Let us know what you think about our opinions, our ramblings, our thoughts, and what your thoughts are on these sorts of campaign systems. If you've written one yourself, if you played one that you particularly enjoyed, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Either way, we'll sign off here. Hit us up on social media, and we'll see you next time on Rule of Carnage. Thanks a lot, and bye.